When my father's and brother's blood stained my hands, I realized that life is real, instant, and extremely shocking. Before I begin this story that I've kept hidden for decades, let me ask you watching, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment which city you're listening from. Each of your comments is like a warm hug to this old lady's heart. My name is Mary Dolan Johnson, but everyone here in Apple, this little corner of Vermont, where the cold makes you believe you're not really in America, knows me as Grandma Mary from the square. I'm 78 years old. My fingers aren't as nimble as they once were. My hair is white and I don't even try to dye it anymore. And I run a small craft shop that's more of a meeting place for the town's elderly ladies than an actual business. I was born in 1947 in a wooden shack with a tin roof in rural Vermont, so far from town that the only car we ever saw was the priest's when he came once a month to celebrate Mass in the makeshift church under an old oak tree. It was a simple house, dirt floor, no electricity, no running water. But in my early years, it still felt like home. There were 6 people in that cramped house. My father, Joseph Johnson, known as Joe the Maine because of his thick hair that he never cut properly. My mother, Sarah, whom everyone called Stern Sarah, not just because of her name, but because of the hardness that farm life had given her. My 3 older brothers, Anthony, Jack, and Peter, and me, the youngest, the only girl, the one who shouldn't have even been born, as my father made sure to remind me whenever he drank too much moonshine after working in the fields. My father was a man of his time and place, a man who believed that women were made for 3 things: working, birthing, and obeying. My mother, poor thing, fulfilled these 3 functions with the resignation of someone who never knew another reality. She rose before the sun to make coffee, worked in the fields all day alongside her husband and children, returned home to make dinner, wash clothes in the creek, and still endure the wheelie duties that my father demanded, even when she could barely stand from exhaustion. A respectable woman doesn't complain, doesn't cry, and doesn't say no to her husband, she told me while teaching me how to grind corn for meal. I was 8 years old at the time and thought it was the most natural thing in the world. How could I know there was another way to live, that not all women accepted being treated as less than human? My brothers, raised in their father's image and likeness, learned from an early age that women were worth less than men, that the world out there was theirs by right, and that at home the final word always belonged to the head of the family. Anthony, the oldest, was the one who most resembled my father, not only in physical appearance, tall, strong, with large, calloused hands, but also in his violent temperament, in the way he looked at women as if they were objects at his disposal. My childhood was divided between hard work in the fields, household chores that my mother taught me from when I could barely reach the wood stove, and the few moments of joy I found hidden under the old maple tree, reading old books that the rural school teacher lent me. I studied until 3rd grade when my father decided that a girl already knew how to read and count enough, and took me out of school to help more at home. "What's more schooling for? You'll just get married and have children anyway," he said, considering the matter closed as he always did. I cried for days hidden in the barn, but it did no good. In our house, Joe, the man's word, was law, and no one, not even my mother, dared to contradict him. It was when I was 14 that things began to change. My girl's body began giving way to a woman's curves. Despite the little food we had, I began to notice different looks from men when I went to the town market to sell vegetables from our garden. Looks that made me uncomfortable, that seemed to undress me without touching. But no look gave me more fear than that of my own brother, Anthony. He was 22 at the time, already a grown man working in construction in town, returning home only on weekends. It was on one of these weekends that I noticed for the first time the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. a look that wasn't from brother to sister that made my blood freeze in my veins and my heart race with fear. I told my mother in a whisper while we washed clothes in the creek far from the ears of the men of the house. "Nonsense, girl. He's your brother. Blood of your blood." "You're imagining things," was her response without even raising her eyes from the clothes she was scrubbing hard on the stone. But I wasn't imagining. I knew I wasn't. And I started doing everything to never be alone with Anthony, to always have someone nearby, to never cross his path when he returned from town with the moonshine already going to his head. Time passed and the situation at home got increasingly difficult. The drought of 1962 destroyed almost all our crops. Money, which was already scarce, became even more so, and my father's temper, which was never the best, soured completely. The beatings my mother received, which used to be sporadic, became almost daily, always for the smallest reason. Cold food, poorly ironed clothes, or simply because he needed to take out his anger on someone for seeing life so hard. My dear friends who have followed me this far, I want to take a pause to sip some water. If you're enjoying my story, even though it's so sad, leave your like and comment which city you're watching from. Each of your comments is a ray of sunshine that illuminates this old lady's heart. It was during this difficult period that my maternal grandmother, Mrs. Josephine, who lived alone in a small house in town, began to get sick. My mother, being an only child, was the only one who could take care of her. After much discussion, my father allowed her to spend a few days a week in town, caring for her sick mother, but only on the condition that I take over all her duties at home. "If you don't manage the work, you'll get beaten until you learn," he warned on the morning my mother left for the first time to town, a bundle of clothes under her arm, and her eyes full of concern at leaving me alone with those men. The first weeks were for adaptation. I woke up before dawn to prepare breakfast, made lunch, dinner, washed, ironed, cleaned, all under the critical eye of my father and the other look of my brother Anthony. My other brothers, Jack and Peter, had already left home by this time, one working at a lumber mill in Maine, the other trying his luck in Chicago. It was just the three of us in that house that each day seemed more suffocating. It was on a Thursday, the day my mother always went to town, that what I had feared so much happened. I was in the small makeshift bathroom at the back of the house, bathing with water I had carried in buckets from the creek, when I heard the door open. Before I could scream, my brother Roni's large, calloused hand covered my mouth. "Don't even think about screaming, brat. I've been waiting for a chance like this for a long time." He whispered in my ear, the hot breath of moonshine giving me nausea. I tried to fight, tried to struggle, but he was much stronger. The details of what happened in that bathroom are things I prefer not to tell, that I've spent my whole life trying to forget. I only know that when it was all over, he left me curled up on the floor, trembling with a clear threat. "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you and Mum." Tears mixed with the bath water as I tried to clean my body, feeling that I would never really be clean again. How could I tell anyone? Who would believe me against the word of the eldest son, my father's favourite? And even if they believed, what would happen afterward? In that place, at that time? It wasn't uncommon to blame the girl herself for provoking men. I spent the night wide awake, curled up on the straw mat that served as my bed, a piece of wood hidden under the pillow, trembling at every noise. The next morning, when my father and Anthony left for the fields, I ran to the creek and washed myself again, scrubbing my skin until it was red, as if the water could wash away the shame and disgust I felt. I decided I would tell my mother everything when she returned on Sunday. Despite my fear of the consequences, I couldn't keep that to myself. I couldn't continue living under the same roof as my abuser without any protection. But fate, which had already been so cruel to me, decided to give me another blow. On Saturday night, while preparing dinner, My father arrived with the news. My grandmother had gotten much worse, was in her final hours. My mother wouldn't return on Sunday as planned. She would stay in town until the end, until the funeral, perhaps for a whole week more. That news was like a bucket of cold water. Another week alone in that house, another week at the mercy of those men. I cried silently while stirring the pot of beans, the tears falling directly into the thick broth without anyone noticing. It was that night after my father and Anthony had drunk almost an entire jug of moonshine and were snoring loudly in their hammocks that I began to plan. I couldn't continue like this. I wouldn't survive another week in that house, not the way things were. I needed to protect myself, and if no one would do it for me, I would have to do it myself. Sunday was bath day for them. Always together to save water, taking advantage of the buckets I filled from the creek. It was the moment when they would be most vulnerable, without the knives they normally carried at their waists, without clothes, without the possibility of easily pursuing me if I managed to do what I was planning. My father kept a sharp machete that he used for cutting wood. I knew where it was. I also knew how to use it. It wasn't the first time I had picked up a heavy tool. I had helped in the fields for as long as I could remember. Had strength in my arms despite my thinness. Knew how to handle that blade. As I planned every detail that night, unable to sleep with my heart beating so hard it seemed like it would come out of my mouth. Something inside me changed. I was no longer that frightened girl paralyzed by fear. It was a different force. A cold determination that I had never felt before. I would survive at any cost. That night, I made my decision. It was them or me, and it wouldn't be me. I spent all Sunday pretending normally. I made coffee, served it without looking them in the eyes, prepared lunch, washed the dishes. Every minute was an agony. Every second brought me closer to what I needed to do. Fear mixed with a cold determination I had never felt before. When the sun began to set, I filled the buckets for their bath, as I always did. But this time there was a different detail. The machete that my father used for cutting wood, the one he always kept sharp as a razor, wasn't in the corner of the kitchen where it usually stayed. It was hidden inside the bathroom under one of the buckets. What happened in that bathroom changed my life forever. I'm not proud, but I don't regret it either. I did what I had to do to survive. When I finished, there were 2 fewer lives in that house and blood on my girl's hands that would never be a girl's hands again. I cleaned everything carefully. I washed the machete in the creek, scrubbed the bathroom floor, dragged the bodies to the hole my father had started digging for a cistern. I covered everything with dirt, stones, dry branches. The moon was my only witness. Before dawn, I was already on the road with a small bundle containing my few clothes and the money I found hidden in the kerosene can. I walked all night to town where my mother was watching over my grandmother's body. I rehearsed every word during that walk. What would I say? How would I explain the sudden disappearance of the 2 men of the house? The story I invented was simple. I had heard them talking about going to the gold mines in California where they said there was gold. Then they had a bad fight and left, each going their separate way. At that time, it was common for men to abandon their families in search of a better life, of fortunes they almost never found. When I arrived at my grandmother's house, I found my mother sitting next to the body, her eyes swollen from crying so much. She saw me arrive and opened her arms without the strength to ask why I was there. "They left, Mom," I said simply, when she finally asked about my father and my brother. "They had a big fight and left." She nodded without the energy to question more. The grief for her own mother consumed all her strength. Perhaps deep down she even felt relief. Who can say? My grandmother was buried the next day. A simple coffin, a wooden cross, few people to say goodbye. After the burial, I looked at my mother and saw a woman broken by life. We couldn't go back to that house in the middle of nowhere with its terrible memories and buried secrets. "And now, Mom, where will we go?" I asked, holding her hand, feeling the hard calluses from years of work in the fields. "We stay here," she replied, looking at the small adobe house my grandmother had left. "This house is now ours. We start over." And so it was. In the following weeks, we adapted our lives to the town. My mother washed clothes for wealthier families. I helped clean houses. We slept on a mattress on the living room floor. Ate what we could buy with the little money we earned. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over our heads away from those ghosts. But ghosts, my dears, sometimes follow us even when we think we've left them behind. At night, when I closed my eyes, I saw that scene again. The machete, the blood, their eyes as life drained away. I would wake up screaming in a cold sweat, smelling the metallic scent of blood as if it was still on my hands. My mother thought it was longing that I was crying for the father and brother who had gone away. "They'll come back someday, daughter," she would say, trying to console me. "When they gather money in the gold mines, they'll come back to get us." How could I tell the truth? How could I destroy the last hope she had? So, I swallowed the tears, nodded, and carried my secret in silence, like a tumor growing inside me. It was during this time that I began to cough. At first, I thought it was just a cold, but the cough wouldn't go away. It came with fever at night with a fatigue that seemed to drain all my strength. My mother, already weakened by the loss of her own mother, now consumed herself with worry for me. "It's just a cold," I repeated, trying not to worry her more. "Tomorrow I'll be better." But I didn't get better. The cough worsened. I began to sweat so much at night that I would wake up with the mattress soaked. I lost so much weight that my ribs showed under my thin skin. The town doctor, called by one of my mother's employers, who saw my condition, made the diagnosis, tuberculosis, probably contracted during the days I spent by my dying grandmother's side. My loves who are listening to me, have you ever received news that seemed like the end of the world? A diagnosis that was almost a death sentence? At that time, tuberculosis was serious, especially for a poor rural girl without resources for proper treatment. Leave in the comments if you've ever gone through a similar ordeal or know someone who has faced a serious illness. Knowing that we are not alone in our struggles helps carry the burden. We need to admit her to a sanatorium. The doctor told my mother, "There's no adequate treatment here. In New York, perhaps New York was like another world to us, a distant, gigantic city full of tall buildings and people too hurried to notice two poor rural women. But it was also our only chance. I won't let my daughter go alone," my mother declared with a firmness I hadn't seen in her for a long time. "If she goes, I go too." That's how 6 months after leaving the farm with blood on my hands and a heavy secret in my heart, I found myself on an endless bus journey to New York. The cough tore at my chest, the fever came and went, sometimes so high that I was delirious. My mother, sitting beside me, held my hand as if she could anchor me to life with just that touch. We had little money, almost no luggage, just the address of a distant countryman who had migrated years before. And they said, had done well in the big city. He was the brother of a neighbour from town, a man we barely knew, our only hope in a huge and indifferent city. When we arrived at the bus station in New York, it was already night. A cold, damp night, so different from the hot, dry nights of rural Vermont. My mother, who had never left the interior of Vermont, looked frightened at the tall buildings, at the lights, at the crowd moving hurriedly around us. Luckily, that countryman came to get us. Mr. Manuel, a middle-aged man with a northeastern accent, already deluded by years in the capital, took us to a small room at the back of his house in the outskirts. The next day, he helped find the sanatorium, got the papers for my admission, even lent money to my mother to rent a room in a nearby boarding house. The St. Elizabeth Sanatorium would be my home for the next 9 months. A sad place with grey walls and the smell of disinfectant, where the constant sound of coughs and moans of pain was only interrupted by the siren announcing meals or bedtime. There, lying on a narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling day after day, I began to relive that afternoon in the bathroom on the farm, not only with guilt or fear, but with a strange sense of detachment, as if it had happened to someone else. Visits were allowed only on Sundays for half an hour. My mother never missed one. She always arrived bringing some fruit, a cookie, any small treat she could buy with the money she earned as a domestic in a family home. She would sit beside my bed, hold my increasingly thin and transparent hand, and tell stories of the big city, of things she had seen, of people she had met. "How are my father and my brother? Have they sent news?" she would always ask, her feverish eyes fixed on my face as if she could extract the truth from me just by looking. "Not yet, Mom," I would answer, averting my eyes, pretending to adjust the sheet. "But they will soon. The gold mines are far away. Letters take time to arrive." It was a necessary lie, I told myself, a lie to protect her, to give her a little hope in those difficult days. Sometimes I caught myself inventing elaborate details that they had found gold, that they were saving money to come get us, that soon we would all be together again. Lies that came so naturally from my mouth that sometimes I almost believed them. 3 months after my admission, my mother began to show the first signs of the disease, the same cough, the same fever, the same fatigue, by taking care of me, by sleeping in the same room when I was in the most contagious phase. She had contracted tuberculosis too. She tried to hide the symptoms at first. She would cough to the side, disguise the sweat on her forehead, saying it was hot, explain the growing thinness by saying she was saving on food to bring me more fruit. But I knew those signs. I had lived each one of them in my own skin. "Mom, you need to get treatment," I said during one of those Sunday visits, seeing how she could barely sit up. She was so weak. "Please go to the doctor." "Nonsense, daughter, it's just a cold." "It will pass soon," she replied, using the same words I had used months before. But it didn't pass. The following week she didn't come to visit me, nor the next. When I finally received news, it was through Mr. Manuel. My mother had been admitted too to another ward of the same sanatorium. For weeks, I begged to see her. The nurses said it wasn't possible, that I was still too weak to walk to the other ward, that the rules didn't allow it. Until one day, one of them, Mrs. Carmen, a woman from the South like us, who had seen something in my eyes that moved her, broke the rules. In the dead of night, she helped me walk through the cold corridor, took me to my mother's bedside. What I saw broke my heart. My mother, always so strong despite everything, was unrecognizable. So thin she seemed just bones covered by a thin layer of skin. Her hair, which already had some grey strands when we left Vermont, now completely grey. Her eyes sunken in their sockets, shining with the fever that consumed her. "My daughter," she whispered when she saw me, trying to raise her hand to touch my face. "Forgive your mother for not taking care of you properly." "There's nothing to forgive," I replied, holding that hand that had worked so hard, that had suffered so much, and that now was so light it seemed it would break between my fingers. "You always did everything for me. Now it's time to rest a little." We stayed like that for a few minutes in silence. just looking at each other until she said something that froze my blood. I know what happened in that bathroom, daughter. I know. My heart stopped for a second. Did she really know? Had she somehow discovered the truth? Or was it just the fever's delirium speaking? "What are you talking about, Mom?" I asked, my voice trembling, my heart racing. "About the bathroom, the machete, the blood," she whispered, her glazed eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, as if seeing something I couldn't see. "I saw everything. In a dream, I saw you." Tears streamed down my face as I held her hand, unable to deny, unable to confirm. She knew somehow through the mysteries that connect mothers and daughters. She had seen the truth. "They deserved it," she continued, her voice just a breath. "I know what Anthony did to you. I always knew he would someday." He was just like his father. I hugged her tightly, openly sobbing now, not caring about the other patients sleeping around us. It was as if an immense weight had been lifted from my shoulders. She knew and didn't condemn me. She knew and understood. "Forgive me, Mom," I whispered between sobs. "Forgive me for not telling you, for lying to you." "There's nothing to forgive, daughter," she said, her voice getting weaker. "You did what I never had the courage to do. You freed yourself. Now you need to live. Live for both of us." Those were her last words. The next morning, I received the news that Mrs. Sarah had passed away during the early morning, alone, with no one to hold her hand in that final moment. The burial was simple, just me, who had special permission to leave the sanatorium for a few hours, Mr. Manuel and the gravedigger, a cheap coffin, a shallow grave in the outskirts cemetery, some wildflowers that Mr. Manuel gathered on the way. There was no money for more, no relatives to share the costs or the pain. I returned to the sanatorium that same day, more alone than ever. At 17, I had lost everything. Father, mother, brothers, home. I had nowhere to return to, no one to return to. I had only a heavy secret and the tuberculosis that was slowly yielding to the medicines. But in my mother's last words, I found a kind of absolution. She knew and understood. She hadn't condemned me. She had asked me to live, to move forward, to find a different path than the one she had. It was this request, this last wish of hers, that gave me strength to fight against the disease, to cling to life when it would have been so easy to simply give up. In the moments of greatest despair, when the fever made me delirious and the pain in my chest was almost unbearable, I remembered her words. "Now you need to live. Live for both of us." And so I did, my dears. So I did. I was discharged from the sanatorium 9 months after entering. I had lost so much weight that my clothes seemed to belong to someone else. In the mirror, I saw an old young girl with sunken eyes and skin stretched over visible bones. But I was alive. I had survived, and I carried a silent promise made to my mother on her deathbed to live the life she never had a chance to live. Mr. Manuel, that countryman who welcomed us when we arrived in New York, helped me in my first steps outside the hospital. He arranged a small room at the back of his house for me to stay until I found work and could support myself. "You can't go back to the farm, girl," he said. "Tuberculosis can return if you don't take proper care. Stay here. Start a new life." That made sense. Not just for fragile health, but because I had nothing and no one waiting for me in Vermont. Only painful memories and 2 bodies buried in a distant yard. I started working as a domestic in the house of an Italian family in Brooklyn. Mrs. Eleanor, the employer, was an elderly lady who had lived alone since her husband died. And her children had returned to Italy. A rigorous woman, but fair, who didn't mind my heavy accent or my lack of experience in big city houses. I see in your eyes that you already carry too much sadness for someone so young, she told me on the first day. Here you will find hard work, but also respect. And so it was. I worked Monday to Saturday from 7 in the morning to 6 in the evening with only an hour for lunch. The salary was low, but it included meals and a roof over my head. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A fresh start. Gradually, I learned to live with my secret. The nightmares still came, but less frequently. My hands no longer trembled when I saw a machete or other cutting object. Guilt. Yes, never completely abandoned me. Not for what I had done. I never regretted that, but for the price my mother ended up paying. If I hadn't done what I did, if we had continued in that miserable life, perhaps she wouldn't have contracted tuberculosis, perhaps she would still be alive. These thoughts haunted me on lonely nights in the maid's room at the back of Mrs. Eleanor's house. Those of you who have been listening to me this far, my dears, do you know what it's like to live carrying a what-if on your back? Like a stone that you can never remove, that weighs more on some days, less on others, but that is always there. Tell me in the comments if you've ever gone through something similar and where are you watching this video from. Knowing that there are people listening from every corner of this country warms my heart. It was on a Sunday, my only day off, that my life began to really change. I was in Central Park, sitting on a bench, watching families walking with their children, couples holding hands, a whole life that seemed so distant from my reality. A young man was playing ball with his friends nearby. At one point, the ball escaped and came to rest at my feet. When I got up to return it, our eyes met. He smiled. A simple smile without ulterior motives, just a silent thank you. Something in that look, a kindness, a sincere curiosity, moved me in a way I had never felt before. "Thank you," he said, taking the ball. He hesitated for an instant, as if he wanted to say something more, but his friends were calling him back to the game. The following Sunday, I returned to the same park, sat on the same bench. I wouldn't admit it to myself, but I was hoping to see him again. And he appeared this time alone, walking slowly like someone who is in no hurry and has no commitments. "You were here last week," he said, stopping near my bench. It wasn't a question, but a statement. "You were too," I replied, feeling my face blush. "Charles," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Mary Dolan," I said, shaking his hand quickly, unaccustomed to this type of contact. But everyone calls me Mary. We began to talk timidly that day, and then we met by chance on the following Sundays. Charles was the son of rural migrants like me, but had been born in New York. He worked as a delivery boy at a neighborhood pharmacy, dreamed of having his own business one day. He had gentle eyes and strong hands that never tried to touch me without permission. Gradually, in Sunday meetings that became a ritual, I began to open up. I told him about my childhood in rural Vermont, about the mother who had died of tuberculosis, about the brothers who had gone their own ways. I spoke of the drought, the poverty, the difficulties, but I never mentioned the bathroom. I never spoke of the machete. I never told about the bodies buried in the yard. Not for lack of trust in Charles, who proved with each Sunday to be a different man from all I had known, but because some things are too big, too heavy to share, even with those we love. Because yes, gradually I found myself in love with him, with the calm way he spoke, with the way he really listened when I told him something, with the simple but honest dreams he had. It was a love different from anything I knew. Without fear, without violence, without that constant feeling of being watched like prey. In the first months, each touch, each proximity made me stiffen, unconsciously expecting the pain that always came afterward. But the pain never came. Only affection, only respect, only a genuine affection that I slowly learned to accept, to trust. Our first kiss happened 6 months after that first meeting in the park. We were sitting on a bench in Union Square watching the pigeons fight over breadcrumbs. Charles turned to me, asked permission with his eyes before approaching. It was a shy kiss, brief, but it made my heart race like never before. When we separated, I saw concern in his eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, noticing my trembling hands. "No," I replied, trying to control my breathing. "It's just that it's never been like this before." "Like what?" Gentle, respectful, as if I mattered. He held my hands between his without force, just a firm and reassuring touch. "You do matter, Mary, much more than you imagine." At that moment, sitting on that park bench with a man who really saw me, who really respected me, who really cared, I felt something snap inside me, as if an old wound which had healed wrong was finally opened and began to heal in the right way. We cried lying on my bed after the first failed attempts at physical intimacy. Charles never pressured me, never showed impatience. He just held me while I sobbed, releasing pains I didn't even know I still harbored. When I finally managed to give myself completely to him months later, it was like rediscovering my own body, no longer as a battlefield marked by violations and pains, but as a place of pleasure, of connection, of calm. We dated for 2 years before getting married. A simple ceremony at the courthouse followed by lunch at his mother's house with the few relatives and friends we had. There was no white dress, no party, no family to walk me down the aisle. Just a light blue dress bought in installments, a bouquet of daisies that Charles brought as a surprise, and a thin silver ring on my finger. We moved to a small apartment in Queens, not far from Charles's mother's house. Just 2 rooms, but ours. A place where no ghosts visited us, where we could build new memories. Good memories that would gradually replace the bad ones. It was during this time that I began to study again. Evening remedial classes twice a week after work at Mrs. Eleanor's house. Charles encouraged me, helped me with the lessons, celebrated each small achievement as if it were a great feat. "You have potential for much more than cleaning other people's houses," he would tell me when I doubted my ability. "One day you'll go to college. You'll be a respected professional. You'll help other people who went through what you went through." At that time, I thought he was dreaming too big. How could a poor semi-literate country girl go so far? But Charles believed in me with such unshakable certainty that gradually I began to believe too. I studied with fierce dedication. Every free minute was spent with books, notebooks, exercises. When I finished the remedial course 3 years later, I had the best grades in the class. The teacher called me aside after graduation. "You have potential, Mary," she said, adjusting her glasses on her thin nose. "You should continue studying." Those words, so similar to what Charles had been repeating for years, finally found fertile ground. The following week, I looked for information about a nursing technical course that accepted scholarship students. "It's perfect for you," Charles exclaimed when I told him about the course. "You, who have suffered so much with illness, will be able to help others not to suffer the same." There was a symmetry in this that seemed right. I, who had known so much pain, could learn to alleviate it in others. There was a kind of redemption in this path that now opened before me. I prepared for months for the selection test. I studied after work on weekends. In every free minute, Charles helped me by asking questions while I washed the dinner dishes. It was quite an effort, and when the result came out, I could hardly believe it. I had passed in 3rd place. The course would last 2 years with classes in the morning and internship in the afternoon. I had to leave my job at Mrs. Eleanor's house, which meant tightening an already thin budget. Charles took on more overtime at the pharmacy. I began doing sewing work at night to supplement our income. They were years of scarcity of sacrifice, but I never regretted it. It was during the nursing course, caring for patients with stories as painful as mine, that I began to better understand what had happened in that bathroom so many years ago. It wasn't just about revenge, about returning the violence I had suffered in kind. It was about survival, about doing what needed to be done to continue existing. In basic psychology classes, I learned about trauma, about defense mechanisms, about how the mind processes devastating events. I began to see my past not just as a sequence of horrors, but as a journey of survival against all expectations. Gradually, the weight of that secret became lighter. Not through forgetting. I never forgot what happened in that bathroom, never forgot the bodies buried in the yard. But because I began to forgive that 16-year-old girl who had no choice, who did what she did to stay alive, my secret stayed with me. I never told Charles, never told anyone after my mother passed. Not out of fear of judgment. With time, I learned that what others think of me matters less than what I think of myself. But because some stories are ours to carry. Some scars are marks of battles we fought alone. Charles sometimes noticed my distant look when something made me remember those days. A news story in the paper. A similar case during my internship. The smell of wet earth after rain. In these moments, he would just hold my hand without questions. Respecting the silence I needed. It was one of the many reasons why I loved him more, each day. When I graduated as a nurse technician at 22, I felt I had finally found my path. Working at the same hospital where I had done the course, caring mainly for women and children, I discovered that my own pain could be transformed into compassion, into understanding, into concrete help for those who needed it. I developed a special sensitivity to recognize the signs of abuse and violence that many tried to hide. I knew how to identify the look of a woman who lived in fear inside her own home because it was the same look I saw in the mirror throughout my adolescence. I recognized in children the same behaviors I had adopted to survive. The way of shrinking when someone raised their voice, the startling at the slightest unexpected touch. Many times I was the first to notice that that fall down the stairs was actually a punch, that those playful bruises were actually signs of something much worse. In the 70s, these things were still treated as family problems in which no one should interfere, but I interfered discreetly, offering information, offering a word of support, sometimes just a look that said, "I know, I understand, you are not alone." Each woman I managed to help, each child I managed to protect was as if I was saving a bit of myself, as if through them I could give the girl I once was the help I never had. The perfect plan, after all, hadn't just been that Sunday afternoon in rural Vermont with a machete hidden under a bucket. The perfect plan was this: to survive, rebuild, transform pain into purpose. It was to use scars not as reminders of what hurt me, but as maps to help others find their own way out of hell. While many plans in life fail, this one, the most unlikely of all, was working. Each day, each month, each year, I moved a little further away from that wooden house, from that bathroom, from those ghosts. Not through forgetting, but through growth, like a tree that, planted in poor soil, finds strength to grow toward the sun. Its roots always firm in the earth that saw it born, but its branches increasingly higher, seeking the light. When I finished the nursing course, my life finally seemed to be on track. I was married to a good man, had a respectable profession, a roof over my head. But inside, I still carried that weight. It was no longer a crushing stone like in the first years, but a constant presence like a shadow that lengthens or shortens depending on the light, but never completely disappears. I worked mainly with women and children in the hospital. It wasn't a conscious choice at first, but over time I realized it was where I felt most useful, where I could really make a difference. I had a special ability to identify signs that no one else noticed. The way a woman would shrink when her husband entered the room, the look of a child that would avert when they mentioned the father or uncle. How do you know? Dr. Sim Robert, the head physician of pediatrics, once asked. After I identified signs of abuse in a girl everyone thought was just shy and clumsy. How can you see what no one else sees? I recognize the look, I simply replied. I've seen it in the mirror many times. The doctor didn't insist, respecting my silence about my own past, but from that day on, he began to call me whenever he suspected similar cases. Over time, I became a kind of reference in the hospital for this type of situation. It was 1975, a time when domestic violence was still treated as a private matter, when child abuse was often ignored or minimized. There were no women's police stations. There were no specific laws to protect victims. There wasn't the social awareness we have today, even if still imperfect. Amid this scenario, I began to do what I could. With the limited resources I had, I would talk privately with women I identified as victims, offer information about shelters that were beginning to appear in the city, sometimes hide a patient in the hospital ward for longer than necessary, just to give her a few days of peace while trying to find a way out. It wasn't much, but for some it was what made the difference between life and death. For many it was the first time someone said, "I believe you," when they told their stories. It was in one of these patients that I saw myself reflected as in a mirror distorted by time. Jane, a fictitious name we used in the records to protect her, was 15 when she arrived at the hospital with serious injuries. Her father and older brother claimed she had fallen down the stairs. But the bruises in different stages of healing told another story. When I finally managed to speak to her alone, I saw in her eyes the same terror I knew so well, the same certainty that no one would believe, that nothing would change, that the only escape would be death. Hers or theirs. "I know what's happening," I said, holding her hand carefully to avoid pressing the bruises, "and I want you to know that you have a choice. There is a way out." She looked at me as if I had just spoken in another language, something completely incomprehensible. The idea of choice, of a way out, seemed an alien concept to someone who lived imprisoned by fear and violence. In the days that followed, while caring for her physical wounds, I also began to work on those invisible, harder to heal. I would talk to her whenever possible, telling stories of other women who had managed to escape, who had rebuilt their lives. I never mentioned my own story, but it was there between the lines in the conviction with which I said, "It is possible to start over." Loves who have been following me this far. Do you know what it is to see someone find hope after so long in the dark? It's like watching a wilting flower that suddenly, with a little water and light, begins to open again. If this story is touching your heart, leave a comment saying where you're watching from. Knowing that I'm not alone telling these difficult memories gives me strength to continue. Jane stayed in the hospital for almost 2 months, far beyond what was necessary for her physical injuries. Dr. Robert, understanding the situation, helped with the paperwork, inventing complications that justified the prolonged hospitalization. We used this time to articulate a way out for her. A shelter for women in upstate New York, new documents, the chance to start from scratch, away from those who hurt her. The night before she left, we sat in the small hospital garden, looking at the stars that were barely visible because of the city's lights. "How will I know if I'm doing the right thing?" she asked, her voice still fragile, but with a touch of determination that wasn't there when she arrived. "You won't know," I answered honestly. "We never know if our choices are right until long after we make them. But I do know that staying where you were wasn't an option. Any different path is already a step toward liberation. The next day, I accompanied Jane to the bus station. No social worker could go. The case hadn't been officially reported to the police, as they rarely were at that time. So it was just me, a nursing technician, exceeding my duties, risking my job to ensure that girl reached the shelter safely. As we waited for the bus, she held my hand tightly. "Will everything be okay?" she asked, fear and hope fighting in her eyes. "It will," I replied, trying to convey more certainty than I felt. "It will take time. It will hurt. There will be days when you'll want to go back, but one day you'll wake up and realize that you're free, that you survived, that you won." When the bus departed, taking Jane to her new life, I stood on the platform for a long time. Something had changed inside me. A door I had kept locked for years, guarding my darkest secrets, had opened just a crack, letting in a bit of light. That night was a turning point. I returned home different. Charles noticed immediately. "Did something happen?" he asked as I prepared dinner, quieter than normal. "Yes," I answered without going into details. But it was something good, something important, he didn't insist. It was one of the qualities I loved most about him. He knew how to respect my silences, my spaces, my shadows. After that night at the bus station, something awakened in me. It wasn't enough to help one or another woman who by luck crossed my path at the hospital. I needed to do more, reach more people, change the system that allowed so many Janes to remain trapped in situations of violence and despair. I began to study for college entrance exams. At 25, with only the remedial course completed and a technical course, the idea of entering university seemed absurd. But Charles, as always, supported me unconditionally. "If anyone can do it, it's you," he would say, on the nights when I almost gave up in the face of the mountain of subjects to study after a full day of work. I took the entrance exam for psychology at NYU. On the morning of the exam, my hands trembled so much I could barely hold the pencil. I looked around and saw only young people of 17, 18 years old, most of them middle class who had studied in good schools, done prep courses, prepared their whole lives for that moment. And me, a country girl, poor, older, with fragmented education and a history that no one there could imagine. When the result came out, Charles was more nervous than I was. He checked the list of approved candidates 3 times before believing. "You did it, Mary. You did it." It was 1973. I entered the psychology college as the oldest student in the class, the only one married, the only one who worked full-time while studying. I had colleagues who were daughters of doctors, lawyers, businessmen, girls who had never needed to work a day in their lives. In the beginning, I felt like a fish out of water, displaced in that academic environment that seemed made for a type of people that didn't include people like me. But I soon discovered that my life experience, so different from theirs, was actually my greatest strength. While we learned about trauma, about violence, about resilience, I wasn't just absorbing theoretical concepts. I was giving scientific names to things I knew in the flesh. This gave me a deeper understanding, an ability to make connections that many colleagues with all their academic preparation couldn't make. During the 5 years of college, I kept my job at the hospital, now no longer as a nursing technician, but as an assistant in the newly created Department of Hospital Psychology. It was a new field, little explored, and I was on the front line helping to define protocols to establish parameters of care. The hard work paid off. I graduated in 1978 at 32 years old. At the graduation ceremony, while receiving my diploma, I looked for Charles in the audience. He was there in the first row, applauding with so much pride it seemed he would explode beside him in my imagination. I saw my mother's face smiling that serene smile of her last moments. "You achieved what I never could to be free," she had said. And I was finally truly free from fear, free from shame, free from the crushing weight of the secret, not because I had forgotten what happened in that bathroom. I never forgot that. But because I had transformed that pain into purpose, that darkness into light to guide others who were still lost in the shadows. I began to work as a clinical psychologist, specializing in trauma and violence. I kept my job at the hospital, now as part of the official clinical staff, but also opened a small office where I attended mainly women and children victims of violence. In the early 80s, with the country beginning to change its views on domestic issues, social movements gaining strength, discussions about women's rights emerging with more vigor, I found space and voice to take this work beyond the limits of the office and the hospital. I began to give talks at schools, at neighborhood associations, at churches. I spoke about domestic violence, about child abuse, about how to recognize the signs, about where to seek help. At first, I faced resistance. People didn't want to hear about these unpleasant subjects. But gradually, very gradually, things began to change. In 1982, together with other women, psychologists, social workers, lawyers, I founded the first shelter for victims of domestic violence in our region. A safe place where women and their children could stay temporarily while rebuilding their lives. We fought for years to get funding, faced threats from violent men who wanted to recover their wives, had to change address several times for security reasons, but we never gave up. Charles, as always, was by my side every step of the way. Even when work took so much of my time that we barely saw each other, even when I received threats by phone from furious husbands whose wives I had helped escape, he never suggested I stop, never complained, never made me choose between my purpose and our marriage. "What you do is too important," he would say when I felt guilty for spending so much time away from home. "You're saving lives. How could I ask you to stop?" We didn't have children. Tuberculosis had left squelly in my reproductive system, making pregnancy impossible. At first, this deeply saddened me. But over time, I realized that perhaps it was part of the universe's greater plan. The dozens of children I helped over the years, whom I temporarily sheltered in the refuge, whom I saw grow and recover from trauma, became in some way my daughters and sons. True liberation, I realized over these years, didn't come on the night I buried those bodies in the yard of the wooden house. That was just the first stage, necessary but insufficient. True liberation came gradually with each woman I helped find her own way out of hell, with each child who managed to smile again after so much suffering. True liberation came when I understood that my story, however painful it might be, didn't define me. That I could use it not as a chain that tied me to the past, but as a tool to build a better future for me and for others. That the greatest revenge against those who tried to destroy me wasn't killing them, but living fully, loving deeply, and helping others do the same. I never saw Jane again after that night at the bus station, but years later we received at the shelter a young mother fleeing from her violent husband. While telling her story, she mentioned the nurse who had helped her escape from her father's and brother's house years before, who had given her courage to believe that she deserved a better life. She said that one day I would wake up and realize that I was free, that I had survived, that I had won, she recounted, holding her small child in her arms. And she was right. That's why I'm here now seeking help again, because I know I can start over once more. At that moment, I understood that liberation is not a single event, but a continuous process. That sometimes we need to free ourselves several times throughout life from the different prisons in which we find ourselves. And that each time we become a little stronger, a little wiser, a little more free. the frightened girl from the bathroom had finally found peace. Not through forgetting, not through denial, but through transformation. What happened that night never ceased to be part of my story, but it ceased to be my entire story. It became just a chapter, painful, yes, but not definitive, of a much larger story of resilience, of purpose, of true liberation. And that, my dears, is the greatest victory we can have over our tormentors. Not allowing them to have the last word on who we are and who we can become. The 80s were a period of great transformations in America and in my life. The country was changing its views on domestic violence. Social movements were gaining strength, and I was consolidating my work as a psychologist and activist for women's rights. Our shelter for victims of domestic violence became a reference in the region, serving dozens of women and children each year. In 1985, when the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence was expanding its influence, I was invited to participate in a working group that would develop proposals for public policies aimed at confronting violence against women. It was the first time that serious attention was being given to this issue at a national level. For me, who had started alone, helping one woman at a time in the hospital, it was almost unbelievable to now be participating in discussions that could change the lives of thousands. The meetings happened in Washington, and with each trip Charles would take me to the airport, always with that proud smile that never diminished over the years. My wife, the doctor, he would joke while carrying my suitcase. Who would have thought that shy girl from the park would change America? He was exaggerating, of course. I wasn't changing America alone. I was just one voice among many, a worker in the construction of a future where women and children wouldn't need to fear their own homes. But each small victory, a new law passed, a police department trained, a protection program implemented, brought a satisfaction I never imagined I could feel. My loves who have followed the story to this point, can you imagine what it is to see a cause to which you've dedicated your entire life finally begin to be recognized? It's like planting a tree and after decades of watering in dry ground, seeing the first fruits appear. If you're moved by this journey, leave your heart in the comments. I really want to know where you're watching from. In the 90s, I expanded my field of action even more. Besides clinical care, hospital work, and shelter management, I began to teach training courses for professionals who worked with victims of violence. Police officers, social workers, nurses, teachers. Transmitting the knowledge I had acquired in practice, transforming pain into learning, was a way to multiply the impact of my work. It was during this time that I received an invitation that would again change the course of my life. New York University was setting up a study center on violence against women and children, and they wanted me to be part of it as a consultant, bringing my practical experience to dialogue with academic research. At first, I hesitated. I didn't have a master's or doctorate, just a degree in psychology and years of field experience. How could I contribute in such an academically rigorous environment? They're calling you precisely because of that, Charles argued. Because of your experience, because you've lived firsthand what most people there only know from books. And he was right, as he usually was. My practical experience was valued as a different but equally valid form of knowledge. I taught classes, participated in research, helped develop care protocols that were implemented in hospitals and police departments across the country. Working at the centre made me realise the importance of documenting the knowledge acquired over the years. In 2003, at 57, I published my first book, Breaking the Silence, a practical manual for identification and intervention in cases of domestic violence. It wasn't an academic treatise full of technical terms, but a simple guide written in accessible language intended for teachers, health professionals, social workers, anyone who could be the first line of defense for women and children at risk. To my surprise, the book had a much greater reach than I expected. It was adopted in training courses, translated into Spanish, and distributed in other countries in Latin America. I received invitations for international lectures for consultancies to participate in global forums on the subject. Charles, already retired from the pharmacy, accompanied me on many of these trips. "I never imagined I would see Paris," he said, as we walked hand in hand through the streets of the City of Light, where I had been invited to a human rights congress. The girl who once dreamed of learning to read to escape the brutal reality of the farm now travelled the world sharing knowledge, influencing public policies, helping to build international networks of protection for victims. Sometimes life draws such unexpected paths that they seem unbelievable. Looking back at the journey I've travelled, from the wooden house in rural Vermont to university auditoriums in Europe, from the abused girl to the woman recognised for her work in defence of other victims, I barely recognise that frightened child I once was. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a long process, sometimes painful, of constant reconstruction, of learning to trust again, to love again, to believe that I deserved good things in life, of transforming anger into fuel for change, fear into motivation for protection, pain into compassion. Charles was fundamental in this process. Our marriage, which lasted more than 50 years, was a partnership in the deepest sense of the word. He never tried to save me. He knew I had to do that for myself. But he was always there offering his support, his love, his unconditional understanding. Even in the moments when I couldn't understand myself, he was there holding my hand in the dark, walking by my side. I never had the courage to tell him the whole truth about what happened in that bathroom, about the bodies buried in the yard. Not out of fear of his judgment. If there was anyone in the world who wouldn't judge me, it was Charles. But because some stories are ours to carry alone, some burdens don't need to be shared, even with those we love most. I think he knew there was something more, a shadow in my past, greater than those I had revealed. But he respected my silence, my boundaries. "What matters isn't what happened to you," he would say. "It's what you did with what happened." And what I did was transform my trauma into purpose, my pain into service to others, my story into hope for those who were still in the middle of the nightmare, not out of altruism. At first, helping other women was also a way to help myself, to heal my own wounds. Over time, it became something bigger, a commitment to change that transcended my personal experience. The loss of Charles in 2015 was the hardest blow I faced since my mother's death. We were so happy together, built so much that it seemed impossible to go on without him. A massive stroke took him on a Sunday morning while we were having coffee on the balcony of the apartment we had moved to after he retired, without pain, without prolonged suffering, as he deserved to leave after a life so full of kindness. In the months that followed, I discovered again the strength I didn't know I had, the same resilience that made me survive that bathroom in rural Vermont. Tuberculosis, so many other challenges now helped me continue without half of my heart. I continued working for a few more years, the centre at the university, the shelter, the lectures, the consultancies. But gradually it became clear that it was time to pass the baton to younger generations. There were now so many brilliant women following the path: psychologists, lawyers, social workers, police officers, teachers, many of whom I had helped train. It was time to let them lead. When I turned 70 in 2017, I officially retired. They organised a surprise party that gathered hundreds of people, colleagues, former students, women who had passed through the shelter, children, now adults, whom we had helped protect. All people whose lives in some way had been touched by the work to which I dedicated my existence. It was at that moment, seeing all those faces, hearing all those thank yous, that I finally understood the full meaning of those words my mother whispered on her deathbed. You freed yourself. Now you need to live. Live for both of us. I had lived. Yes, not just survived, but truly lived. And not just for myself and my mother, but for all the women who didn't have a chance to escape, who didn't find help in time, who couldn't rewrite their stories, as I managed to rewrite mine. After retirement, I made a decision that surprised many friends in New York. I returned to Appleton. Not to the farm, of course, that place with its dark memories probably no longer existed, but to the town, which had grown and modernized in the half-century since I left it. I bought a simple but comfortable little house near the central square. I opened a small craft shop, more as a pretext to have a place to receive people than out of financial necessity. There, among laces and embroideries made by women from the region, many of them rescued from situations of violence through a social project I helped implement, I sit every day and talk with whoever wants to. The people of the town know me as Grandma Mary from the square, the white-haired lady who tells stories, who listens without judging, who always has a word of comfort. Few know my complete trajectory, the published books, the international lectures, the pioneering work in New York, and even fewer know the deepest secret of that bathroom in rural Vermont, of those bodies buried in a yard that probably no longer exists. Sometimes when I'm alone at night looking at the stars through the window, I still think about that day, not with guilt. That emotion was left behind a long time ago. I think with a kind of quiet acceptance. I did what I needed to do to survive, and then I used my survival to help others not need to do the same. Life has this strange way of creating meaning even from the most painful experiences. What seems an unbearable curse can with time and work transform into a blessing not just for us but for others. Our deepest wounds, when healed, can become sources of healing for the world around us. If you, my dears, who have accompanied me this far, take any lesson from my story, let it be this. The past marks us but doesn't define us. We can choose how to use our scars, whether to perpetuate pain or to recognize and heal the pain of others. We can be shaped by the violence we suffered or by the strength we discovered to overcome it. The choice is difficult. The path is long, but it is a possible choice. Today at 78, I look back with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. Amazement for the child who survived against all odds. Gratitude for the life I managed to build from the rubble of what was taken from me. I don't know how much longer I have in this world, but I know that each day is a victory over those who tried to destroy me. Each smile is an act of resistance. Each moment of peace is proof that in the end they didn't win. I won. I not only survived but flourished, and I helped others do the same. I also ask with an open heart that you like this video, subscribe to the Grandparents' Tales channel, and especially comment where you're watching from. Each story shared is a hand extended to someone who may be going through the same now, feeling as alone as I felt in that bathroom so many years ago. Life isn't easy for anyone, my loves. We all carry our burdens, visible or not. But if we can share the weight, if we can extend a hand to each other, if we can transform our pain into purpose, well, there lies the true miracle of human existence. The ability to rebuild from scratch, to be reborn from our own ashes, to find light even in the deepest darkness. I'm Grandma Mary from the Square, and this was my story. Thank you for listening to me with such affection and respect. May God bless each one of you, and may strength and hope never be lacking in your hearts.